In my previous episode, I spoke briefly about what are containers, and we spoke in length about the Azure Kubernetes service on Azure Stack HCI. But if you look at containers today, few containers can be easily managed either by Docker or by Windows. But applications today often make use of 5s and 10s and hundreds of containers at scale. Now the question is, how do you manage such large containers at scale? And this is where the Kubernetes comes into the picture. So Kubernetes is an open source tool which was open sourced by Google way back in 2014, and it was adopted by the industry. So in this episode, we're going to look at how Azure Kubernetes Service has adopted the Kubernetes orchestration to simplify the deployment and management of containers at scale. Hi and welcome back, and thanks again for tuning into Jayant on Cloud. My name is Jayant. I work as a Senior Principal Engineering Technologist at Dell Technologies. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. Now, in this episode, I'm going to walk you through how to deploy Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, and also look at how to create an Azure Kubernetes clusters on Azure Stack HCI. All right, so without wasting much time, let's dive right into it. Now, before you begin the deployment of AKS and then the Kubernetes clusters, there are basically two methods to do it. One, you can use Windows Admin Center, or you can use PowerShell. Now, in this demo, I'm using Windows Admin Center. So you can also use PowerShell to deploy the AKS and then the Kubernetes clusters. Now, so it's a two-step process. So first you will set up AKS on Azure Stack HCI, and then the next step is to create the Kubernetes cluster. Okay. So from a Windows Admin Center, if you're using Windows Admin Center, so in my demo in this episode, I'm using Windows Admin Center. So if you're using Windows Admin Center, make sure that you have installed the latest and the greatest of Windows Admin Center. I think 2103 or later is what is recommended. So right in this example, I'm using 2110. Okay, so just make sure that you're using the latest version of Windows Admin Center. And not only that, it's very important to update all the extensions under the settings that you see. A gear icon on the top right hand corner of your Windows Admin Center. So just click on that and then go to extensions and then go to installed extensions, and make sure that all the extensions are updated. Okay, so we want to make sure, because there are a lot of bug fixes which have gone into these extensions as well. So we want to make sure that it's updated to the latest and greatest. Now, for production environments, you have to basically accurately size the Azure Stack HCI cluster nodes, which are physical nodes. In the example, in the demo for this episode purposes, I'm using nested virtualization. So basically, the nodes are the virtual machines. But in case of production deployments, they will be physical nodes. So if you're obviously buying the services and the nodes from Dell, we ensure that it's all sized accurately, right? So you don't have to worry about that. But what you really need to take into account is how many containers you're going to be spinning up in your worker nodes, and what are the size of these containers, and all that needs to be factored in. Okay, so it's a very, very important step to size the solution accurately before you go ahead and deploy AKS on Azure Stack HCI. From a domain controller perspective, although Microsoft does not recommend you to have a separate or a dedicated domain controller for Azure Stack HCI clusters, but it is recommended to have a dedicated domain controller for Azure Stack HCI because it gives you better control in terms of organization unit, if you have your own OU, it gives you better control in terms of security, governance, and policies, and gives you more granularity, right? So that's very important. Ensure that your keytab command works on the domain controller, because this is something that we're going to be using this command to create a service principal name when you select the authentication method as AD authentication, okay, which we'll see that in the wizard when we create the Kubernetes clusters. From a DHCP server standpoint, if you're using a static IP, which is what is recommended by Microsoft documentation, but make sure if you're using static IP, make sure you have a dedicated subnet for AKS. Okay, so you dedicate a particular subnet for AKS clusters. If you're using DHCP, in my case, I'm using DHCP. Make sure that you create an exclusion range for the virtual IP pool. So if there's going to be a virtual IP start IP, and then end IP. So you need to make sure that those ranges are excluded in the DHCP scope. All right, so these are some of the important parameters to keep in mind before you proceed with the AKS deployment on Azure Stack HCI. Now, these are some of the important links that I've actually referenced here. Very important links. Basically, these are all Microsoft documentation. This is basically using Windows Admin Center. How do you kickstart with deploying AKS on Windows Admin Center, and then create Kubernetes clusters using Windows Admin Center. It's all again, it's a Microsoft documentation. So this is an additional thing which I've included, because in this use case, in this demo, I'm using AD authentication. So there is a step to create API server and an AD account, and then generate a keytab file. So this link basically has all that information and commands to execute the API server, AD account, and then generate a keytab file. All right, let's begin with the demo then. The Windows Admin Center, which I have here. Now, if I look at this one, right? So basically, I have a 2-node cluster. Each cluster is each node has about 24 gigs of RAM, and I have a separate dedicated storage for the AKS volume. Excuse me. So if you look at the volumes here, so I've created something known as AKS volume, which is specifically dedicated for the Azure Kubernetes service clusters. Okay. All right. So now let's go into. So if you're in the homepage, let me just go back again. So go to Windows Admin Center homepage, and then you click on the Azure, the Azure Stack HCI clusters. Okay. And on the left, you see an option which is Azure Kubernetes Service. So if you just click on that, let's wait for it to come up. All right, now you see a setup screen. So if you've already set up Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, you will not see the setup option since I've not set it up. So since I'm doing it for the first time, you will see I'm seeing the setup option. Okay, so click on setup, and just again, very important, check the prerequisites, the same documentation it leads you to. But again, these prerequisites are mentioned here. A cluster running Azure Stack HCI or Windows Server, it could be any one of them, and a virtual switch for internet connectivity, because you would need internet connectivity for the AKS clusters, even just to register the AKS clusters against an Azure subscription, and for doing the automatic update and patching and so on. So you need 30 GB of total available memory for the clusters, so that's very important. 1 terabyte of cluster chain volume, which I've already created, and Azure Stack HCI must be registered with Azure. So you see, in my case, if I go into dashboard, right? So it says Azure connected, right? So those are the prerequisites to make sure that before you start spinning up Azure Kubernetes service. Okay, so now let's go through, click on next for system check. So it will basically go through some of the system checks. So basically it will connect to the Azure Stack HCI clusters to ensure you meet the prerequisites before continuing further. Okay, so let's wait for the prereqs to be complete. All right, so now once the prereq system checks are complete, you are presented with this screen, which is basically asking you to install the PowerShell modules that are required for creating the Azure Kubernetes service clusters. Okay, so let's go ahead and install the required PowerShell modules. And you can also review the system checks that it has done. So it has basically checked whether there is slots available in terms of the total memory that is required, and there is a clustered shared volume. In my case, it's AKS volume 1. So there are 2 volumes, but I'm going to be selecting this volume. And for each individual nodes, it talks about what are the different virtual switches and the logical processes that are available, and different features like roles and features like the Hyper-V features that are enabled or not. So all and the firewall changes, because there are few firewall changes that are required. For example, the port. These ports are supposed to be these are inbound ports. It will check whether these ports are open. If it is not, then it will actually open those ports as well. And the same thing with the other node as well. Okay, so let's wait for the required PowerShell modules to be installed fully. Okay, so it looks like I think it has installed all the required PowerShell modules. So let's click on credential delegation. Next. Okay, so this as you can see, it enables you to enable CredSSP. So that Windows Admin Center can pass through the credentials to the servers in the cluster. So let's enable CredSSP. All right, so you see a green tick here. So CredSSP is now enabled. Let's click on next to post configuration. All right, so now basically this is where there are 2-step process, right? So right now we are actually deploying AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes service. And then the next step, once you have deployed AKS, the next step is to go deploy the AKS cluster. So it's a 2-step process. So for now, we are actually deploying the AKS service. Okay. So now, as you can see, the cluster shared volume. So I know there are 2 volumes which I have. One I'm using for the virtual machines, but this particular volume is dedicated for the AKS. So I'm going to select that. And for internet connectivity, I've already configured this particular switch for the nodes, cluster nodes, to communicate through the internet. I'm not using any VLANs to connect to the internet, so that's the reason why I selected no. And Cloud Agent IP. So this is something that you can you can specify an IP address for the AKS management agent. So when you deploy an AKS cluster, it actually creates a management cluster. So which is, in this case, like we talked about in my previous episode on AKS overview, it creates a single node management VM. So that's the VM that we're talking about, which is the Cloud Agent VM. So for that, we need to specify a particular IP address, right? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a particular IP address here. I think I'm going to give okay. All right, so IP addressing method, like I said, you can either use static method or DHCP. I know static is recommended. That way you don't have issues with changing IP addresses and so on. But for my ease of configuration, I've just selected DHCP because I keep destroying the cluster and recreating often. Okay, so I've selected DHCP. So this is where the virtual IP pool starts. So that's where I actually spoke about the leasing. Say adding exclusion list, which I showed you. So I'm going to put that the same range which I put it in the exclusion range in DHCP scope. The same IP pool start and end. So the same IP address are going to be here. So in my case, it's 154 and 0.0.0. Okay, so that's my IP, virtual IP starting address and the ending address. Okay, so I don't have any proxy settings. No, it's not behind the proxy, so I'm not going to select that. And that's it. So bypass this has to be on. So let me just click on Azure registration. Okay, since the cluster is already registered against Azure subscription, so I'm going to pick. So it's already populated. So I'm going to pick subscription that I'm going to use and the resource group. Okay, and the region that I want this to be. So in my case, it's Southeast Asia. And then click on Next to review. All right. So now, if you see, it passed the system checks. I'll briefly give you the summary of the host configuration that I'm doing, that is specified in the wizard and the Azure registration. And after that, just click on Apply to apply these configurations. And it does take a while, so let's wait for it to apply these configurations to the clusters. All right, so there you go. So it has been successfully applied, right? So right now the Azure Kubernetes service is set up. Now the next step is to create a cluster. Okay, so now let's go here and click on Create Cluster. So this will take roughly about 30 minutes in general. That's what I've seen. So let's see. So like I said, this is just setting up the Azure Kubernetes service, right? So after this step, we're going to be setting up the Azure Kubernetes service clusters. Okay. So let's wait for the AKS service to be deployed, and we will come back again to set up the cluster. All right, so welcome back, and looks like I think we have completed setting up the Azure Kubernetes service. So it took about 25 minutes. Like I said, roughly takes about 25 to 30 minutes. So let's click on Finish. Okay, let's wait for it to gather the information. Right, let's wait for the page to load. Great. So now the Azure Kubernetes service is successfully set up. The next step is to create a Kubernetes cluster, right? So now we have successfully deployed the single node management VM, right? And that's been set up. Now using the single node management VM, we're going to orchestrate by creating a cluster, which is the AKS cluster. So you can just click on Add Cluster. All right, so now for creating a cluster, there are some prerequisites again. Is what you need to get started. So on the system that will host the Kubernetes cluster, so like I said, Azure Kubernetes service must be set up, which we've just set up now. And then on the Azure Stack HCI, you need 16 GB of available memory to run the VMs, right? Which we have sufficient memory, that's not a problem. And 10 GB of free space, which in fact our cluster shared volume is close to 1 terabyte, so that's not a problem. The other important aspect to it is, register the Windows Admin Center with Azure. Okay, so this is something that is very important. If you haven't registered, I strongly suggest registering this, Windows Admin Center. So you can have that. Okay, click on Basics now. So now the next screen, connect to Azure, because obviously you want to kind of manage your clusters from Azure control plane. So if you want to click on enable, or if you don't want to, you can just disable it. So in my case, I want to enable this, Arc using, I want to manage these clusters using Azure Arc. So I've enabled this. And I'm going to pick the subscription that I'm using, the source group, and the Azure region. In Southeast Asia. Okay, and the credentials for you to connect to the domain. These are the domain credentials which you need. So it's going to go and validate the domain credentials. This is against the Azure Stack HCI cluster. Okay. Let's wait for it to validate. All right, so let's come back again. So looks like I think the cluster has been successfully validated against the credentials, which is the Azure Stack HCI clusters. Has been successfully validated against domain credentials. And then you select the Kubernetes cluster name here. So I'll just leave it as default. And the Kubernetes version. So let's make sure that you pick the latest Kubernetes version there. And this is where you need the primary node pools. So in my case, there's a load balancer that you need to set up. So we can leave it as default, but if you want to make sure that you change it, you also have an option to change the VMs queue as well. So in my case, I'm just going to leave it as defaults. So this is where the control plane node VM size. So make sure that you specify the recommended one. Because if you have lesser memory and a vCPU, sometimes it can get into a problem. So make sure that you use recommended. So higher is better. Okay. All right. So let's click on node pools. So now click on add a node pool here. So this is where you actually create a worker node pool. Okay. So in this case, we can just put a node pool as we can just give any name for this. I'll just probably give JY. All right, so I will select the OS type as Linux and the default memory size. So this is something that I would suggest increase it a little more, because this is the one that's going to create a lot of problem. Okay, so if you don't have substantial memory on your workload cluster, you won't be able to deploy your either Linux container or a Windows container. So in this case, since I've selected the Linux container, I'm a Linux node pool, I'll be able to deploy a Linux container. So make sure that you have adequate memory and vCPU to go with it, right? So for this case, I'm just going to use it because I'm not going to deploy any container workloads here. Okay. For simplicity, for this demo purpose, I'm just going to use one node count and just leave it as default. Click on add. Right. Next is authentication. So this is very important. Either you can select an AD authentication, which I'm going to select right now, or you can select or you can disable it, right? So I'm going to walk you through a few steps that are required to set up an AD authentication. Okay, all right, so now here we are in the AD authentication step, right? Now, so before you, we are using AD authentication in this demo for single sign-on to clusters, okay? Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the steps that are involved to enable single sign-on using AD authentication. So there is a document here, that Microsoft documentation, which talks about using AD authentication for single sign-on purposes on AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Okay, so there are some prerequisites to be met, so which we have kind of taken care of, but the only thing is we don't have a keytab file. That is something that we need to generate, right? That keytab file does not exist. But also, if you see, it requires a service principal name. Okay, so it needs to be in this particular format, service/principal in this format, and the keytab file also needs to be generated. So let's look at this documentation. So if you go down all the way down, so there is an option here that says, okay, so here it is. Create the API server AD account and keytab file. That's exactly what we want, because this wizard is asking for an API service account, and because it's if you look at here, it requires a service principal name in this format and also a keytab file. So which we're going to see how to generate that, right? So we can just copy this, and this needs to be executed on the Active Directory. Okay, so we need to create a new user, on the Active Directory, and the corresponding password or whatever it is, right? So let's do that. Let's go right into let's jump into our AD VM. So let's see where our AD VM is. Here we go. All right, so now I'm going to copy that command into a notepad and make some changes to it suits my environment. So create new AD user. So I'm going to leave the API, the server name as API server, the account name as API server. Leave everything as it is. Probably change password. Okay. And everything else I'm going to leave it as it is. Okay, so let's copy this command and run this here. All right. Okay, so looks like I think the this command got successfully executed. Now the next step is if you go back here. So we need to create the keytab file for that AD account, right? Using the command ktpass. So ktpass is the command that we use. So we can just copy this command completely, and again go into my AD system, AD virtual machine, AD, and let's check if ktpass is available. Okay, so which means the keytab command is available, just that because I have not specified the service principal name. So in this case, I'm going to modify this to suit my existing environment. So hot.contoso.com. Mac user, API service account. So it is going to be right. So I just want to make sure everything is right. principal AKS API server at corp.com, and just copy this command and execute this command. Right? Oops. Okay, sorry. It's got to be here. I need to change this. This is the problem with copy paste. So it needs to be corp. Okay, that's my domain name. Right, so let's execute. Sorry about that. It's an API server. The account name is API server, which we just created in the first step. That's here. You can see here. Right, so this is the name that we create. So we need to make that change. Okay. So password should create. Great. So we'll see if this is created here. I think the best way to look at it is go into okay, C drive. System 32. Is that where it is? Yeah. Yep, there you go. So there is this current.keytab file. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this keytab file into our management system where we're actually running the cluster creation wizard. Okay. All right, let's go there. Okay, let's store it in a particular location here. It is easier to access. Okay, we can store it right here in the C drive. Oops, sorry. Create a folder. Let's copy the keytab file. Right, so now let's go here, and the service principal name, as you can see, it needs to be in this format. So in our case, it's k8s/API server at corp.contoso.com. So type that in, k8s/API server at okay, so let's make sure it's in this format. Service is k8s, principal is API server at my domain name, which is corp.contoso.com, and let's upload the keytab file. So which is in C drive, keytab folder. Let's upload this. Okay, just going to validate that, and the cluster admin group or the username. So in my case, so let's see the format here. Very important. So you can just put this as is my cluster admin. So it's not part of the admin group, so I'm not going to check this box, but it's just a user. So I'm going to just put lab admin. Okay, click next. So this is a network configuration which is Calico or I would say read up. This is basically the container network interface plugins, right? Either you can use a Flannel plugin or a Calico plugin. So for now, let's use the default one. So the virtual network, since I've already selected DHCP, so it's going to pick the DHCP network, which is automatically renamed as AKS default network. Okay. All right. So and then okay, so select this network. Right. Okay, let's click on review and create. All right, so just create, reviewing this again. Connection to Azure Arc is enabled, and this is the Azure subscription. The resource group that's going to join to Kubernetes cluster's name, right? So this is the workload cluster, remember, right? So that's the name that, when you create this cluster, it's going to be created with this name. The Azure Kubernetes service host name, which is the host, the Azure Stack HCI, which is a cluster. And then cluster admin, which I've provided here, Kubernetes version, and the load balancer's queue sizes, the VM's queue size for the load balancer, the control plane, and the number of nodes that I want to spin up. So in this case, it's just one single node for simplicity. And the node pools, which is the Linux node pool, worker node pool, which I'm creating, which is just one, and the authentication method, which we saw, and the networking aspect. So with that, let's hit on create, and this is going to take some time. So let's wait for some time and come back to this video again. All right, so now welcome back, and finally, the Azure Stack HCI cluster has been successfully set up. Okay, it's up and running, and it's healthy. Okay, not only that, it's also been onboarded to Azure Arc. Okay, so we can go here and check, log into the portal, go to Azure Arc, and under Kubernetes clusters, you see the two clusters. One is the management cluster and the workload cluster, which is my workload-cluster. My workload-cluster has been successfully onboarded to Azure Arc. Now, so I'm going to tell you in my next video what you're going to do with it, right? So what are the different things that you can do now that the AKS cluster has been successfully onboarded using Azure Arc. So we're going to explore some of the application services like data services, app services, and so on, and see how we can make use of those services using the Kubernetes clusters using Azure Arc. All right, so with that, I've finally come to the end of this episode, probably a very lengthy one at that. But just to summarize, we looked at how to deploy Azure Kubernetes service and then create Kubernetes clusters. So in my next episode, let's look at how to deploy Azure Arc enabled services. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe.